This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your home for investment, economics, and geopolitics. For our publications and archives, go to goldnewsletter.com. This is Fergus Hodgson, and you're listening to the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. And we're exploring somewhat of taking a different tack. Rather than examining the ingredients of capitalism or or investment or business friendliness, we will explore the outcomes. And just last month, I came across a fascinating index which I hadn't heard of before, but it's produced by an old friend of mine, and it's called the Family Prosperity Index, put out by the Family Prosperity Initiative, and the director of this is Scott Moody, who's also the CEO of the Granite Institute, which is in New Hampshire. And he has a long bio, so let's just say thanks first for joining us, and then I'll go through more of your bio, mate.
Thanks, Fergus. Appreciate it.
And he's been a public policy economist for 18 years. He has an MA in economics from George Mason. He was the CEO and chief economist of the State Policy Network, and then he also led the Maine Heritage Policy Center, so he's up in New England, and he has a whole bunch of other titles. He also was the original co-creator of the Tax Foundation's very popular State Business Tax Climate Index, which is in its 14th year of publication. So he is supremely qualified to talk about this, and I just confirmed with him before. I know he's a family man, and he has 5 children, and I think he may even homeschool them. So he also, when we're talking about family prosperity, this is what the index discusses, where in the United States are the most prosperous states. He has a family. He's showing it is relevant to him too. Unlike me, I'm still a bachelor. You wanted to go beyond the regular data, and why don't you tell us the backstory about how you got to this index? What motivated you to create a new index? I mean, there are many out there. How is this one unique, and what motivated you to come up with it?
Absolutely. Living in New England and northern New England in particular, dealing with economic issues over the years, really came to understand that there's more to solving New England's problems than just economic policy, for instance. So one of the issues that northern New England's grappling with right now, and I'm not sure how they're going to turn it around, but it's an issue called demographic winter. And this is something that's actually going on internationally. Europe and Japan are much further along, where the population now is actually declining. There are too few young people left in those countries to sustain their population levels. Well, New England is ground zero for demographic winter in the U.S., and this is something I've been grappling with for years and looking at, and I'm trying to think, well, how do we solve this? Well, of course, as you know, the first step to solving a problem is to first understand the problem.
I see 2 problems. One is, I guess, low fertility, because we know people here there are living a long time. There's no problem there. And then the other one is just people moving away to other states. Which 2 ingredients are most important?
Well, absolutely, and that all goes into the Family Prosperity Index so that we can then start ranking states and see which states are doing better with family prosperity and which ones aren't doing so well. So we put in 60 variables. There are 60 variables. It's the most comprehensive index of its kind that are tiered into 6 major indexes. We have economics, demographics, family self-sufficiency, family structure, family culture, and family health. And what we found is the states that rose to the top 3 were Utah, North Dakota, and Idaho, and the bottom 3 are Mississippi, New Mexico, and Virginia, although the rest of the bottom 10 contain a lot of New England states. And Utah is from a complete polar opposite from New England. Here's a state where obviously religion and family are very important. And it was actually quite surprising. It was kind of the opposite, as I was saying, where by putting the family first, I did not expect Utah to also be very strong across the economic measures. We all know they were doing well demographically, but it's translating into economic success as well.
You expressed your underlying concern for this demographic winter, or the declining population, not necessarily declining just yet, but maybe declining or heading in that direction in the New England area. When you were first looking at the underlying problem, do you have any sense for which are the most important ingredients, the decline in fertility or the migration?
No, decline in fertility absolutely is the primary driver. And the reason The reason is because fertility is one of those equations that is exponential. So when fertility started to shrink, you don't feel it immediately. But when you start going out a few decades, suddenly things start to turn and start collapsing very, very quickly. And in Maine, for example, the labor force has already reached the crescent and is now falling year over year, and it's going to accelerate as we move forward. And that's going to obviously cause a lot of problems. One, it means fewer laborers in the state. It means fewer consumers in the state. And it's going to feel like a slow-moving economic depression in the state of Maine. They're already feeling it in the northern parts of the state, but soon the entire state will be feeling the negative impacts of demographic winter. And that's why the case of Utah was so exciting, because it's the exact polar opposite. They have a very high fertility rate, large young population. Their overall population is going to be growing for the next couple of decades, and that's translating into economic success. So you can see how the two are polar opposites, and one's going one way and the other's going the other.
Yeah, I'm going to share. People go to the show notes, just goldnewsletter.com/podcast, and you'll find this episode here. I think we're up to episode 32 now, or 33. And if you look at the map of the outcomes, it's actually fascinating. The green states, which are the 10 most prosperous, are all in the middle. The Midwest, I guess, going down to Texas. So yeah, the best one, Utah, and then Idaho is nearby. Where's number 2 there? I've lost it there. Anyway, North Dakota, right? So yeah, those Midwestern states are really leading the way, and then the struggling states are, I guess, not necessarily New England. I guess Rhode Island is up there, but they're on the more towards the coast. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama are down the bottom there, and so yeah, it is geographically divided. I wouldn't necessarily have expected that, but it's clearly there. It's clearly a geographic split. Do you want to comment on why that is?
Well, really, especially on the low end of the spectrum, what that's picking up on is the breakdown of the family. And unfortunately, in America today, there are two groups of people who have suffered the most under the family breakdown. That's African Americans and Native Americans.
Right.
And so you can see that explains why Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana are near the bottom. And then New Mexico and Arizona both have large Native American populations, and that's a negative. But then you have states like Ohio and West Virginia, where we're seeing now this new phenomenon where low-income whites, the family is breaking down in a big way and very rapidly, particularly in these Rust Belt states where there aren't a lot of jobs, and because of that family breakdown, now they're joining the bottom of the heap, unfortunately. As
part of this Family Prosperity Index, I mean, as you said, there are 60 different ingredients, and you point out things like single parenthood to obesity. Do any particular variables within the 60 stand out that you found fascinating or surprising?
Well, going through it all and putting this index together, there were a lot of, on the social side in particular, that, being an economist, I weren't necessarily familiar with for a very long time, and yet their importance to all this. So, we have a measure in here called families with related children who are in poverty. And that's an average of all families, but there are really two types of families. There are married families, and then there are single-parent households. What I was really struck at is the difference in poverty rate. So if you're a married family, you have a poverty rate, a chance of about 8%. But if you're a single-headed household, the poverty rate is over 36%. And as a country, you probably are very familiar that the poverty rate has been stalled out since the so-called war on poverty has started. Well, now we're on the verge, because the composition of American families now, the single-parent households have grown tremendously, that composition may actually start pulling up the poverty rate in the very near future. Now, can you imagine in the wealthiest country in the world that the poverty rate may actually start rising? But the core reason behind it is not economics. It's a social factor where the family is broken down.
When I look at this map, too, immediately pieces of data stand out to me that are surprising, such as the fact that Delaware and Rhode Island have some of the least healthy families. They're down at the bottom. And so Rhode Island 45th, Delaware 46th. How can these relatively wealthy parts of the country be struggling so much in terms of creating healthy families?
Absolutely. I would change the topic for a second to New Hampshire, because New Hampshire is a very wealthy state in New England, but we have some very deep-seated problems that are now showing up in drug overdoses. So we're leading the country, one of the states that are leading the country in drug overdoses. You have to ask yourself, same thing's going on in Rhode Island. They're having a huge problem with a drug epidemic with heroin and then correspondingly with drug overdoses. And you have to ask yourself, why are these wealthy states, basically killing themselves with drugs? And one thing that these two states have in common is that they're one of the least religious states in the country. And as I was doing this research, I came to find out that religion highly correlates with the level of drug use within a state. So Mississippi, for example, we talked about Mississippi ranks very low overall, but it's a very religious state. They don't have nearly the drug problem that New Hampshire does, which is a much wealthier state, yet not very religious. So here we're showing a direct connection between what people consider a social factor, religion, having an positive economic impact in states because of reduced drug use and therefore drug overdoses, which obviously, having your young people die at such an early age, it's going to have a huge negative impact, and it's having a negative impact in New Hampshire.
Yeah, this is something that I think many of us intuitively realize, that having a healthy, stable family, so many ingredients go into it. And so just income alone is not really sufficient.
That's right.
Yeah, so this doesn't necessarily fit up there, although I assume Utah does do well. And I should just point out, I'm not sure whether you've worked with ALEC before, the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, they have rich states, poor states, and they also find that Utah is the top. So Utah, they have, as you said, healthy families, according to this index, and they do have favorable economic policies. So the two go hand in hand there, but it's not necessarily a clean kind of pattern. Now, you chose to relocate your family in New Hampshire after living in the D.C. area, and you were even working in Maine at that time. So how would someone, many of us are mobile in this era. Let's say you're a young couple and you're thinking, where would we live to have a family? Would you actually say, go to one of these green states, the top 10?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And you look at Utah, for us, I've lived on the East Coast my whole life, and Utah is like another country in terms of its geography. And it's a very beautiful state, and it's growing like crazy. And one of the reasons why it's growing like crazy is because people are moving into the state, which when you think about, Utah is pretty, but it's not California. But yet Californians are leaving and moving to Utah, and you have to ask yourself, why? Why is that? And I think the allure of what Utah has created is what's pulling folks in. When I picked New Hampshire to live in after, living next door in Maine, I really made those considerations based on economics. In essence, the state of Maine, by not paying income taxes anymore to the state of Maine, is basically paying for my house in New Hampshire. And that was a huge positive. But since coming here, and again, this is where the origins of the Family Prosperity Index came from, I moved here thinking in a way this was utopia. And from an economic policy standpoint, no income tax, no sales tax. Unfortunately, we don't have right to work, and we just lost that battle again. But for the most part, it's working. On the economic side, we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. But then you start to see how the decline in religion, for example, the decline in fertility, and the decline in the family overall has really negatively impacted even a wealthy state like New Hampshire. And I do fear that some of these gains that we've made on the economic side will be eroded, if not lost, in the future if we don't correct some of these more social factors in the state.
I don't participate in organized religion, but I will agree with you that it seems clear that organized religion does have a positive impact on fertility. And assuming that we don't want the Western world to decline, we see it, it's having a positive impact there. So do you think state policies should actually take into consideration religious participation, or how to be more friendly to that?
Well, we definitely don't want the state involved in religious issues per se, but fertility issues, we definitely could have, for example, a more friendly tax structure in the United States today. I mean, we just did our taxes at the federal level, for example, and we have a child tax credit. But unfortunately, if your income's above a certain level, they start phasing it out on you. And I'm like, wait a minute, children are expensive. and where we've set the level for phase out doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That is very family unfriendly because folks with big families actually pay a penalty. You get it phased out, I think, at a 5% rate. So basically add a 5% surcharge on top of your federal tax rates for big families. I mean, that's ridiculous. But yet that's how our tax code is. So we should be encouraging larger families and removing these penalties that are embedded within the tax code. That would be a start. Much more obviously needs to be done in other areas.
And do you want to give people a little bit of data to get a sense for how much what the birth rate might be, for example, in Utah versus West Virginia? Do you have any numbers on that just to share with people? What are the family sizes in those two states?
Oh, I do have the numbers, not a tip of my hands, but I can tell you for your listeners, if you go to familyprosperity.org, we wanted to be 100% transparent with everything that went into this index. So we have a data app that's on our website, and you can dig down into the data and see how your state compares, say, against your neighbors or against the national average. And also, we're going into the states as well, and we've done a couple of states already, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Utah, Wisconsin, and we're going into others, where we did build a county-level app for those states. So the states I just mentioned already have this, and we drilled down and look at the data at the county level because you can find some very interesting trends. Like in Utah, for example, Utah is a runaway number one right now, but we noticed when you drill down to the county level that Salt Lake County, for instance, that's where most of the migration is occurring, unfortunately, they're importing a lot of the social pathologies that exist in other states, and now their crime rate is higher and suicide is higher in that county. So there's some red flags even within Utah, but it's only because they're really importing those problems, and you can only see that by drilling down to the county level. So we feel that's a very important element.
This seems like one of the more distinct or interesting or helpful indexes that I've come across in my time, and I've read so many of these ones. And many people around the world, myself included, have looked at New Hampshire as somewhat of a leading light in terms of fiscal policy. And even here, when I was in Dublin a week or two back, I met a guy from Poland looking to move to New Hampshire. The fame is so wide, worldly. And you've set up a new think tank, I think just a couple of years old, the Granite Institute. And you said you just felt on the right to work law, but what is this? You have an article here, the New Hampshire Advantage, right? So what is this New Hampshire Advantage you are promoting?
Absolutely. I mean, New Hampshire Advantage is the fact that, compared to the neighboring Maine, Vermont, and Massachusetts, the economic policies in the state, without a doubt, are very, very positive. I mean, as you talk about, the Fraser Institute's Freedom Index, for example, has New Hampshire ranked number one, and a lot of other freedom indexes have New Hampshire ranked either in the top 10 or even number one as well. And that's the New Hampshire Advantage, basically. I've estimated that because of sales tax differences alone, that New Hampshire imports basically almost $2 billion a year from Maine shoppers because of the lack of a sales tax and cross-border shopping. That's empirical evidence of the New Hampshire Advantage at work. But unfortunately, as I was saying, despite the fact that anybody in New Hampshire can get a job at the drop of a hat, the fact that there is huge opportunity, economic opportunity in the state. A large number of folks are turning to drugs and are killing themselves through drug overdoses. That's pointing to a much deeper seated level of hopelessness. In fact, there was a survey that came out and showed New Hampshire had one of the highest levels of suicidal thought amongst young adults in the country. And you have to ask yourself, what's going on there that there would be so much hopelessness amongst young people in this state when economic opportunities abound? And that's the fundamental question that the Granite Institute is involved in trying to answer, and we're pushing reforms that we think will help. I mean, we do need right to work just to remain competitive as a state now that the majority of states have right to work. But we're also pushing for school choice because we believe that ultimately, if you're not coming out of school with a good education, your economic opportunities will be limited moving forward. And then also we've done a special study on the opioid crisis as well, trying to bring law enforcement and treatment community and policymakers together to start brainstorming about how we tackle that very important problem in the state.
Yeah, mate, that's such a fascinating problem because here in Cork in the south of Ireland, there is just this boom in investment. So many foreign companies are starting up here, and there's a housing shortage because it's so popular. And yet, there is this drug problem that I asked a local realtor, is there crime? And he said, well, not really. He said, mainly you'll just get petty criminals who are people addicted to drugs and need money quick. And he said he didn't know the answer, and I don't know either. And why would it be that these wealthier areas seem to be more inclined to unhealthy drug problems?
Well, and Fergus, I think you'll be interested in this story. So a lot of the drugs coming into Maine and New Hampshire are coming from Lowell, Massachusetts. And Governor LePage there has already kind of got into a verbal war with the governor of Massachusetts and the mayor of Lowell, for instance, saying, why don't you guys do something to stop this flow of drugs? But then about a week and a half ago, Governor Sununu in New Hampshire also got into the same verbal war with the mayor of Lowell. Sununu went so far as to threaten to send the state police down there. So we've got a potential border skirmish in the United States over this drug epidemic because it's reached epidemic levels. There's nobody in the state of New Hampshire who doesn't know somebody who's been affected by the drug epidemic, because we're a small state. There's only 1.3 million people here. Same in Maine. So that level of exposure has really gotten everybody on edge, and it's gone all the way to the top where now I guess the next step would be for Maine and New Hampshire to send in the National Guard and occupy Lowell, Mass. I don't know where it's going to end at this point.
I don't know either. And just for people who don't know, LePage is governor of Maine, and that borders New Hampshire, and it's right. Lowell is a city. I'm not sure how many people are in Lowell, but it's not too far from the border with New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And this is a very, old and relatively prosperous part of the United States, which is always peculiar to me because, as you might imagine, I'm for decriminalization of drugs or some sort of more liberalization, what is politically feasible. But at the same time, that does not mean I support their use. I think it's really problematic, and I think it can be destructive. So I'm always curious as to how, the ingredients that make this happen. And in some ways, I fear that in this case, it seems like the victims or the users are disconnected from the producers. So maybe Lowell is enjoying the monetary stream coming in there, so the local officials there don't want to deal with it. Do you think that's at play?
It very well could be. I mean, there's also some evidence that it's centered around the immigrant community, and Lowell being a sanctuary city, obviously what's going on nationally is now playing into this discussion as well. So, there's a lot of complicating factors. I mean, we're talking about big international cartels potentially playing, and we all know what's going on with Trump, with the Mexico and United States, with the border wall and all these issues. So you put all that together, and, you've got a big cauldron that's going to be tough to simmer down here moving forward.
Man, I'm a bit frustrated that you didn't pull off the right to work victory there. People should know right to work just means that if you want to get a job, you cannot be prevented from taking the job if you're not a union member or don't pay for union dues. And you were doing excellent work there. You had lots of union leaders saying it's fine, we want to have competitive, healthy unions. What got in the way of that one?
Well, it was very disappointing. I mean, we have a Republican governor for the first time in over 12 years that was actively talking about the need for right to work in the state. Conservatives controlled both the House and the Senate. You thought that it would be a done deal, especially on the heels of Kentucky going right to work and Missouri going right to work. I mean, two states that right there in the Midwest. I think what happened is, based on talking with folks on the ground in Kentucky and Missouri, is that there was almost really no union presence fighting that in those two states. Yet in New Hampshire, there was a huge union presence. And I think what happened is the unions decided to focus their resources and keeping, New England behind the union curtain, if you will, and use that, and of course the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. Those are really the two regions left in the United States where there's no significant right-to-work presence. And I think they're thinking, that those are going to be our two bastions, and we're going to hold them at all costs. And they poured tons of resources into New Hampshire. I mean, there were ads. You couldn't go on the internet without running into some union ad, for example. The airways, they packed the State House during the hearings and, shouting down people that were proponents for it. So they clearly made that decision, and we were just, I think, at the end of the day, outgunned.
Mate, well, keep up the fight. So, folks, I'm obviously a big fan of both these publications or organizations, Family Prosperity Initiative and the Granite Institute. Granite is just the Granite State, New Hampshire. And any other website you want to plug before I let you go, Scott?
Well, I would like to plug keypolicydata.com because that's been a long, multi-year project that I've been working on, that I've been trying to bring my research. I've done a lot of cross-comparative studies across the United States, and I'm trying to put that up online and make that as user-friendly and as available as possible. The same app that we use for the Family Prosperity Initiative is being used on Key Policy Data, and I think a lot of particularly grassroots-type folks who really want to be able to get the data on their state or even down to their county can do so easily on KPD.
Right, and the latest article there of interest is titled United Van Lines, Migration Data Shows Taxes Matter. So I'll link to that article as well. Scott, keep up the work, and I look forward to being in touch.
Thank you, Fergus. I appreciate it.